Learn 5 easy ways to cut your deck down to 100 cards, next on Commander Replay. Welcome back, everyone. Today we're going to be talking about 5 easy ways to cut your deck down to 100 cards. Last week I had done a video where I'd actually gone through a deck where I was cutting cards, but it was kind of a longer form video. So today I wanted to do something, but in the quick tips style format, because I think these 5 tips will make it much easier for you to cut your deck down to 100 cards. All of the suggestions in this video will be based on the deck building philosophy of running 10 ramp spells and 10 removal spells. And like anything else, there will always be exceptions in deck building, but I want you guys to stay focused on the content and not on the exceptions. I will point out a few exceptions that I did notice seem to come up a few times while I was going through this. And those are your all-in aggro style of decks with things like Krenko, Edric Spymaster of Trest, and Azuri. They came up a few times. Mono green decks also came up as a bit of an exception to some of these rules as well. And lastly, a lot of what I'm going to talk about does not apply to CEDH. They have their own thing going on over there. Competitive decks operate pretty differently from that of a normal commander deck. Anyway, with all of that, let's get into the first tip. The first thing to do is focus your deck. And we're not actually going to be cutting any cards yet, but I just want you to sit and think critically about your deck to figure out what is the main point of your deck. And that's going to be a couple questions like, what is your main win condition? And what are the most critical pieces to that win condition? So you want to spend a few minutes thinking about those sort of things if you don't know them already, but answering these 2 questions will help significantly when you have to start cutting cards to get your deck down to 100. And that'll bring us to tip number 2. We're going to cut the cards that aren't critical to our deck. So in step 1, we determine the cards that are critical. Now we can start to think about the ones that aren't. Some of the cards that aren't critical to our deck may fall into some of the following categories. If there's any non-bows or cards that are actively bad with other cards in your deck or your commander. Cards that are overly situational, so you'll see some very situational cards on this page, and I'm not saying you should never run these, but you should consider what your deck wants to be doing if you do. I've seen plenty of aggressive Boros lists that run Wild Ricochet and Reverberate. I found it pretty hard to hold the mana up for those cards if you're trying to get creatures into play and hit for big attacks. For me personally, I found them way too situational for what I want to be doing in an aggressive deck, because with most creature combat based decks, you are going to be tapping out most of your mana during your main phase. That's just kind of how they operate. A more Spellslinger, Control, or Combo style of deck may be holding mana open and using it during other players' turns, which may make something like Wild Ricochet or Reverberate a better card. So in all cases, we see some situational cards that have a home somewhere, but not necessarily in every deck, even though they may be able to do some pretty cool things some of the time. Now, one quick thought on Warping Whale, that counter-target sorcery mode is pretty cool, and that can stop a lot of nastiness, but if you draw it in your opening hand, you may have to be prepared for it to sit in your hand for 10 or 12 turns before someone tries to lay down an Exsanguinate or Expropriate or something like that that really needs to get countered. So again, not a bad card, but it is situational and it's not good all of the time. Some more situational cards to look at. One that's come up for me over and over again is Firemade Avenger. That battalion ability is a condition, and it's actually harder than you think to meet that condition outside of a devoted token deck. And once you get that condition met, the ability is fine, but it never really blows you away. So when I'm looking at my Boros decks and I've got a super crowded 4 slot, Firemade Avenger is something that I've been cutting in favor of Bruce Tarl and Iroas, which are just good almost all of the time. So yeah, you'll want to get rid of cards that are overly situational or have some tough conditions to meet where the payoff isn't worth meeting the condition. Another situation is having redundancy where redundancy isn't needed. Theoretically, you could run Craterhoof Behemoth, God Eternal Ronas, and Decimator of the Provinces, all of which give you some sort of overrun type effect, but realistically, most green decks operate with Craterhoof Behemoth and a couple ways to tutor for it, so you don't necessarily need redundancy for this ability. So of the 3 cards shown here, I would only run one of these, run the best one that's available to you. So here, we see some cards that are good, but not necessarily part of our main plan. A Patreon supporter of mine was running Mystic Confluence and Cryptic Command in their Dragon deck, and I'll mention it again, when you're playing a creature deck, you're going to be tapping out during your main phase. It's going to be really hard to leave 3 blue and a colorless open during your opponent's turn if you're still trying to get dragons into play. Mystic Confluence, same thing. If you're trying to get dragons into play, it's going to be really tough to leave 5 mana open to hold up that Mystic Confluence. Now, I'm not saying don't ever run counterspells in your Dragon deck, but if you feel like you need access to counterspells, I would run something like Negate or Arcane Denial, because those are much easier to leave open in an Dragon deck. And again, we see the situation I talked about with Aurelia on the other side, with Aurelia, Dualcaster Mage, and Wild Ricochet. Again, if your deck wants to be tapping out to do things during combat on your turn, That means you're not going to have that much mana left over to hold up during your opponent's turns. You're going to want to give a really long look to whether you should be running cards like Dualcaster Mage and Wild Ricochet in your aggressive decks. Next we see backup card packages. I see that people like to go pretty deep on a backup plan a lot of the time. What I have found is that if you're running 10 pieces of ramp and you're running 10 pieces of removal, that you do not have a lot of room left over for an elaborate backup plan. Plan A is going to take up most of your deck space, and I found that I almost always have to cut Plan B from my deck. Just a quick example, those feather builds that I was working on last week, in the Voltron Pump build, I also wanted to keep in Balefire Liege and Firebrand Archer, but when it came down to it, there just wasn't room for those, and I had to cut both of them, and I've seen that same sort of thing in almost every deck that I build. I start off with some package of a backup plan, and there's just never room for it. Now, if you want to run a backup plan in your deck, you can run 1 or 2 cards as a backup plan, but they better be powerful on their own. So we see a couple examples on screen, again referencing that same Ur-Dragon deck. My Patreon supporter asked me about using Expropriate in the Ur-Dragon, and I sat there and thought about it for quite a while. Even though Expropriate doesn't have any immediate synergy with the Ur-Dragon, it's still just a really powerful card, so if something terrible happens and all your dragons get wiped and you can't get any into play, Expropriate is still a really nice backup option because you don't need anything else to make it good. Same thing with Godo and Helm of the Host combo. You can kind of just jam that in any red deck, because if you find that Godo late game, it's going to find you the Helm, and as long as you have the mana to equip, things are going to be looking pretty good for you. And then we have Insurrection. It may be part of your plan, it may not, but it's just a powerful card on its own. If you need some kind of backup plan, you can run it if you need to. So yeah, your backup plan should be limited to 1 or 2 cards, and those cards should be very powerful when you play them. So now that we've finished cutting cards that don't fit the main theme of what we're trying to do in our deck, we still may have more cards to cut to get down to 100. So the next thing we're going to do is cut by the number of cards in each card type. So people send me a lot of already completed deck lists to look at, and this is actually one of the first things I'll do when I'm looking at their deck. Now, I'll do this in a slightly different order if I'm still working on the deck, and let's say there's still like 120 cards left in the deck. This won't necessarily be the first thing that I do, but I do keep an eye on this as I'm going through the deck. So let's talk about how many cards you want in each card type. First up is lands. Lands are the really easy one. You want 37 or more lands in your deck. That is 500 point font on screen. I just thought you should know. Never less than 37 lands unless you're playing competitive Commander. So simple, but such a hard rule to follow. Let's move on to creatures. So for me personally, creatures are my favorite card type, and that I have the most fun playing, but I know not everyone agrees with me on that. Anyway, when building a deck, even a heavily creature-focused deck, there are very few decks that want to go north of 30 creatures in their creature count. So if you're trying to cut your deck and you notice you're above 30 creatures, first thing to do, start cutting creatures. Now, there are a few exceptions to decks that may go over 30, and that's going to be your things like Krenko, Edric, Izuri. Your low-to-the-ground aggro, low-to-the-ground tribal kind of decks may want to run more than 30, but there's still plenty of reasons why they may not also. So yeah, there's a small number of exceptions of decks that may want to run more than 30 creatures, but in general, most decks do not want to run more than 30 creatures. Now what I have noticed is that specific deck types have limits on about how many creatures they really want to run and still have the deck run efficiently. For a lot of the Boros creature decks that I've built, I've noticed that 26 is about the max. If you run more than that, that means that you're not able to run enough removal, you're not able to run enough ramp, you're not able to run enough equipments and protection stuff like Sunforger, Teferi's Protection, Boros Charm. So when you start getting north of 26 creatures, you really run out of deck slots for other cards that are very important. So I kind of split it up between Aurelia Voltron and other Voltron decks, and the reason I did that is because Aurelia is 6 mana, so there are many times where I go Voltron on a creature that's not her first because it takes so long for her to get into play. So in those decks, I'll run about 23 creatures as the maximum, because again, if I go more creatures than that, then I just don't have enough slots in the deck to have the removal and to fit in all the equipments especially. Now, for a more typical Voltron deck, where you're going in Voltron on the commander, you can run significantly less creatures than that, and those decks typically run less than 20, sometimes less than 10, depending on what the commander is. You could build like a Ural the Miststalker deck with probably 10 creatures or less. Basically just like Farhaven Elves and Auramancers. So for a devoted Voltron deck, you really don't need that many creatures in the deck. If you're trying to run Voltron with 25 or more creatures, you're going to feel that deck get really crowded and it's going to be tough to get into things you want. Next up is going to be big creature decks like Angels, Demons, Dragons. I found that I really don't like to run more than like 20 to 22 of whatever that creature type is. Now, I may have about 25 creatures total in that deck, with maybe 4 or 5 of those creatures being ramp or utility cards, things like a Farhaven Elf, a Burnished Heart, a Solemn Simulacrum, or a Stoneforge Mystic. So for me, usually around 24, 25 creatures, but only about 20 of them are actually the big tribal creature. Now, I have seen people run some higher creature counts in the Dragon. It can be a bit of a give and a take there. If you're running like a slightly higher count at like 25 or 26, that means that you're probably going to be playing a dragon every turn. And it also means that you're going to be pretty vulnerable to a board wipe. You want to get a couple creatures down, but at some point you need to be able to cast other cards that aren't creatures. So for me, that 20 to 22 is really what I found to be about right, and that gives me enough access to ramp, removal, and other types of effects that I need for my deck to be successful. Mono green is probably going to be a little bit more of the exception. I don't play tons and tons of mono green, so I haven't experimented with exactly how many the right number of creatures is, but the main difference with green is that green gets a ton of effects from its creatures, things like Terastodon, Woodfall Primus, Bane of Progress. There's a lot of removal stapled into green creatures, so I wouldn't be surprised to see some mono green decks run about 30-ish creatures. But again, that's kind of a max. You can certainly run less than that. Controller combo decks, definitely not going to be running that many creatures unless it's some sort of creature-based combo, then you may, but for a more spell-based type of combo deck, you're probably not going to be running all that many creatures. You may be running 15 or less. It will depend specifically on what the combo is and whether it cares about creatures, but for those style of decks, a low creature count is probably where you're going to be. I find that it's rare to be at more than 25 or 26 creatures in a deck. So if you're trying to cut your deck down and you're seeing a creature count north of 25, it's probably correct to cut a couple creatures from your deck. Next, we're going to talk about spells, instants, and sorceries. There isn't specifically a right number for a given deck, but it's more about thinking about the balance of your deck. So for example, if you have 25 spells and 15 creatures in your deck, in a short game, let's say 8 turns or less, you might only cast 1 or 2 creatures, and the bulk of the things that you're doing are going to be spell-based, which means that you might be sitting there with open mana waiting to do spell stuff. If that's the focus of your deck, then life is good. But if the focus of your deck is to be attacking with creatures, then that's probably not so good. So I ended up looking through a bunch of recent decks that I played on the channel. I noticed that the Angel Reanimator has 17 spells in it, many of which are board wipes. Kamal had about 15 spells in it, had a ton of artifacts though. The Queen Marchesa Iron Bank, which was a combo deck, had 27 spells in it, so for a combat-based deck, I would say 15 to 20 spells is a great starting place. You may have a few more, but you may also have a few less. Now, being that I look at a lot of Boros deck lists, people do send me deck lists that have like 20 Sunforger targets in the deck, and if you're running that many Sunforger targets, that means that you're probably not casting all that many creatures. You may have 1 or 2 in play, but it's probably going to be tough to have a lot of creatures if your deck's running like 30 spells in it. So just think about the balance of your deck and how you want it to play. If you want to be casting primarily creatures, you're going to want more creatures than spells. If you're going to want to be casting more spells, then obviously you're going to want a higher spell count. So just think about the number of spells versus the number of creatures, and think about how you want that to shape your deck. Next up is enchantments. For this one, we'll be talking about specifically non-enchantress builds. There are a lot of good enchantments floating around, but the one thing that I do see when I look at other people's decks is that they tend to have a few too many enchantments, especially for a combat-based deck. If you're a creature deck running 10 enchantments, that's probably going to be too many. I took a look through a bunch of my recent decks, and my enchantment count is generally between 4 and 8, and I found that to be a pretty good place, aiming for somewhere around 5 enchantments or so. But if you're using a devotion god, you may want to run a few more as opposed to a few less. Just as a quick example, if your deck has 21 creatures and 15 enchantments, there's going to be times where someone lays down a board wipe and you don't have a creature in your hand to cast. You'll probably have some enchantment stuff to do, but after just a little bit of removal, there's a good chance that you'll run out of creatures for a little while. Now, as long as that's part of your plan, that's fine, but again, if the idea is you want to have a lot of creatures in play and you want to do stuff with them, then a 21 creature, 15 enchantment balance probably isn't right. I would subtract 5 or 10 enchantments and add some creatures back in there. So yeah, like I've said, for a creature-based deck, less than 10 enchantments, probably near 5 is about where you want to be. So if you're running more than that, cut down to about 5 enchantments. Artifacts. So artifacts can vary pretty heavily from deck to deck. Green decks will typically run less of them, but will have more cultivates and things like that. For non-green decks, you're probably looking at a higher number of artifacts, since that's where a lot of your mana ramp will come from. Mono red and mono white decks will probably be the highest of the bunch. I noticed the Kamal deck that I ran recently was running a staggering 32 artifacts in it, and my Guardian Avacyn deck is running 26. Most of the Boros decks that I've built are usually running between 15 and 25 artifacts, depending on the focus of the build. The Shalai Angel deck that I ran recently had 8 artifacts in it, but again, it has green in it, so it does have access to green ramp, so it didn't need to lean as heavily on artifacts. So again, there's no right or wrong numbers here with artifacts, but less is better when someone lays down that Vandal Blast or Austere Command. They are a fragile card type, so when you can get their effect from a more robust card type, I would definitely steer you in that direction. Next up are Planeswalkers. Unfortunately, I don't run enough Planeswalker decks to have any great advice for you, but I assume that 30 is too many, and in the little bit that I've messed around with Super Friends, I would say that between 20 and 25 is probably going to be the maximum number of Planeswalkers that you want, and running less than that could certainly make sense also. Before we move on, let's talk about the tribal problem. The tribal problem is, to have your deck feel like a tribal creature deck, you want a lot of that creature type, which often means probably running 25 to 30 of that creature, but when you're running about 30 of a creature, that does not leave you with a lot of room to be doing other things in your deck. So when I build a tribal deck, I notice it's this constant struggle of getting enough creatures versus getting enough ramp, removal, card draw, and other utility effects. To try and make a long story short, the problem will largely come down to the quality of creatures in your tribe. A tribe such as Angels, you only need a couple in play to really do a lot of damage and have a lot of impact on the board. A lower quality tribe like Elephants is going to struggle because each elephant just doesn't have that much board impact, which means that you're also going to need to run cards like True Conviction or some other type of pump spell to make your team better. And this usually means that you're going to have to subtract cards from somewhere to make all this work, and that's probably going to be your ramp and your removal. So that is one of the problems with building a lower quality tribe, is that you are generally able to run a little bit less removal and a little bit less ramp in that deck because you need to run enough creatures and because you need to run ways to enhance those creatures. It just doesn't leave you with very many deck slots left over. That's going to bring us to tip number 4. This is the big one. This is the one that I use more than anything else. This is how I get my decks down to 100 cards for the videos that I make, and can generally make my decks operate effectively without necessarily ever having played that deck before or a deck similar to it before. And that is cutting cards by converted mana cost. So if you stop and think about it for a second, it makes total sense that a deck can only support so many cards at a given mana cost. I noticed that my decks were operating much more effectively after I started really paying attention to where things were on the mana curve. I know some other YouTubers have talked about constantly decreasing your mana costs is the way to go. While that is true for the highest power levels of play, I find that for anything less than competitive Magic, a balanced mana curve is going to serve you better. Having a balanced mana curve allows you to have cards to cast at all parts of the game. This means that you can make small value plays in the early game, but also have big stuff to go to when the game gets big. You don't want to be on turn 12 or later of a game with a deck full of 3 and 4 drops. You're gonna want some 6 and 7 drops to really give that late game punch to try to win. However, a handful of 6 drops on turn 4 is not where you want to be either, so it's all about balance. Based on my years of experience deck building and the several hundred decks that I've built for this channel, these are the approximate limits and target areas that I've come up with for each converted mana cost slot. And if you follow them, it will help you both cut your deck down to 100 cards and allow it to operate efficiently. So starting with the 1 converted mana cost slot, I don't spend a lot of time focusing on 1 CMC. Either you have cards like Vampiric Tutor, Sensei's Divining Top, or you don't, so just do what makes sense for your deck. So with that, let's move on to the 2 and 3 mana cost slots. Both of these slots operate similarly in that they give us great early game plays, but many cards here, not all, but many, will lose value as the game goes longer, especially ramp and creatures. A turn 2 Signet is great, a turn 15 Signet isn't. Although Stoneforge Mystic is pretty much awesome all the time, but I think that one is the exception and not the rule. But either way, we do want to have enough things to do in the early and mid game, but leave ourselves deck slots available for some late game plays. So I found the limit is about 17 cards for each of these slots. You really don't want to go over that. Things get kind of wonky if you do. But really you want to target around 12 or 13. That's where I found the best results. And one thing that I didn't actually think about until I started doing this video is that if you have 17 2-drops and 17 3-drops, that's 34 cards. That means that there's not really going to be a lot of room left in your deck for big late game plays. So just be aware of that. Looking at a few recent decks that I've played with, I've noticed that my combined 2 and 3 mana drop slots were ranging from about 17 to 30. The Angel Reanimator was on the low side with 17, since there's a lot of late game action in that deck. The Kamal deck that I played though had about 30, since that was more of a Voltron combo deck. The pieces work together in that deck and don't necessarily lose value like some other cards do as the game goes longer. The Drana deck that I did recently had 25 combined, and that's a fantastic place to be when you have about 12 and 13 of each. That gives you plenty to do in the early game and leaves you with plenty to do in the late game. Also, I noticed that a lot of my big ramp decks came in right around 20 combined 2 and 3 drops, and as you'd expect, those are mostly ramp cards, but that still leaves us with plenty of room to do things up at the big end of the curve. Also, one thing that I noticed is that if you're doing an equipment deck, there's a ton of equipments at 3 converted mana costs, so the 3 converted mana cost slot is probably going to be a little bit bloated, and you're going to be up around that limit of 17. Again, I would really try not to go over 17. It will be a struggle in those decks, so do your best to get it to 17, a little bit lower if you can. Moving on to 4 converted mana costs. Now, when people send me deck lists, they are usually overloaded on 4 converted mana cost cards. I found that having about 10 cards at 4 CMC is about right, and you really don't want to go over 13. 4-drops are great for the early and mid-turns, but cards in this slot, especially creatures, can lose value as the game goes longer. So you don't want to go wild with 4-drops, aim for about 10. Now, on some occasions, if I notice that the higher parts of my curve don't have much going on, I'll actually replace something like a Wrath of God with a Fumigate or a Descend Upon the Sinful, or as another example, something like a Harmonize, replace that with a Soul's Majesty or some other bigger draw spell, depending on what colors you're in, just to smooth out the curve more. So there are times that if your 4 converted mana cost slot is too crowded, actually going up the mana curve might be a good idea. Moving on to 5 converted mana costs. Similar to 4 converted mana costs, I do look at a lot of decks that are really clunky on 5 drops also. I don't think people realize how clunky 5 drops can actually be, and while there are some great cards at 5 converted mana costs, the jump in power when you get to 6 and 7 mana is very real. So again, this is another slot you don't want to go wild with 5 drops. I target about 8 of them and I limit myself to 10. And I noticed that when I was looking through my recent decks, I actually applied this super consistently, and all of my decks were between 7 and 9 5 drops. That's going to bring us to 6 converted mana cost. These are the heavy hitters. You've got things here like Titans, True Conviction, Mana Reflection, Rishkar's Expertise, and Consecrated Sphinx. These are the type of cards that if they stay in play for a little while, can win the game. And even though I generally want less 6 drops than 5 drops, on occasion I will notice that I have more 6 drops than 5 drops because of that huge spike in power you get for a relatively similar amount of clunkiness mana-wise. Now, as great as 6 drops are, you can't run 30 of them, even though I've tried. And that deck plays out exactly how you would expect it to, it's just super clunky. So yeah, you need to be super diligent about your 6 drops. I target about 5 of them and really don't want to go over 7. And I noticed, even with my big ramp decks, I still stayed under the limit of 7 6-drops, just that those decks run more cards higher up the curve. Also, quick note, exception for the Dragon. Unfortunately, most of the good dragons that were printed at 6 and 7 mana, so you're just going to have a lot of these in that deck. But the cost reduction is a thing, so the limits may shift a teeny bit for commanders that reduce or cheap mana costs, or generate mana. So that's going to bring us to 7 converted mana cost cards. If we thought that our 6 drops hit hard, our 7s can hit even harder. Here you'll see things like Shieldred, Elish Norn, Gisela, Mind's Dilation, Cyclonic Rift, and Zendikar Resurgent. These are the cards that you want to see late in the game, especially after a board wipe. Let's say post board wipe, you land a 7 drop, and your opponent lands a 5 drop. Excluding combo engines, that 7 drop is going to be better almost all of the time. And it took me a while to realize this. Like many people, I thought that Boros meant I had to be fast, so I ran with a lower curve and actually ran 0 7 drops in my older decks. But now, I really recommend against this. You really do want 2 or 3 cards that can just take over the game for you, especially if it gets late. Certain decks just can't operate if you have an Elish Norn on the field, and it's more decks than you think. But as great as 7 drops are, you can only run so many of them. I target to run around 2 or 3 for each deck, but have a limit of 6. And 6 is definitely the hard ramp decks. That's going to be my Angel Reanimator, Gishath, Orixmethes, and my various mono black decks. With decks like these, it's important to remember that almost every card goes into supporting large converted mana costs, so if you're running 6-7 drops, you better be running a ton of ramp in your deck. And that's going to bring us to 8 or more drops. I run many decks that don't contain any 8 drops at all, or many times I run a lone 8 drop, which is Ugin, because Ugin is the ultimate problem solver. But for my decks that do run a significant number of 8 or more drops, these are going to be the big mana decks. And this is really where you start to see separation from your mid-range decks to your big ramp decks. And for me, the decks we're talking about, again, are going to be Angel Reanimator, Orixmethes, Sea Creatures, Josu Ves, and Gishath. Of these decks, Orixmethes was the only deck who broke the limit of 6, and I'll be the first to tell you that the top end of that deck is a bit clunky. The other decks that I mentioned are all at 6 or less on this converted mana cost slot. And of note, I recently added Razia to my Angel deck as the 7th 8 or more drop, and it has affected the performance negatively, so I'll need to cut something, probably Retachroma or Iona in matchups where she's not welcome. But even for big mana decks, 3, maybe 4 is still going to be the target for how many cards you should run in these converted mana cost slots. And again, maybe an exception here or there if you're a very hard mono green or Simic ramp deck, but I still just have a hard time envisioning the deck that can support more than 6 cards at 8 or higher converted mana cost. Maybe Rakdos Lord of Riots, but there aren't many. Oh, also of note, I don't actually consider Blasphemous Act a 9-drop, because that's not how you actually play it. Typically, you're probably going to pay 4 or less, and because it's a removal spell, you only play it when you need it. So I don't really consider Blasphemous Act at part of the curve 8 or higher. Personally, if you wanted to put it at like 4 or 5 converted mana costs, that's probably a much better read on how that card's actually going to play. But for me, I usually just leave it hanging out in the end and just don't think about it all that much. So I would not count that toward the limit of 8 or more drops in a deck. So yeah, this is the major tool that I use to cut cards from my decks, and I've followed these rules pretty closely. The only deck that I found that really violated any of the limits was Rixmathies. So to make a long story short, if you're struggling with what to cut, check out how many cards are in each converted mana cost slot of your deck, and then cut them down to the limits, and better yet, cut them down to the target numbers, and that'll both get you down to 100 cards, and should allow your deck to operate very efficiently. And that's going to bring us to our last tip, tip number 5 for cutting your deck down to 100 cards. Never cut lands. Do not cut your lands from your deck. Your deck will not operate properly if you do. I know it's so tempting to get that last 1 or 2 cards into your deck, but if you start cutting lands, you're gonna have mana troubles, your deck is not going to operate properly, and you're gonna have to sit around watching other people play Magic while you get land stuck and do nothing. Maybe not every game, but certainly more frequently than if you didn't cut those lands. So never ever cut your lands. Always 37 lands plus. And sadly, the answer usually is cutting a creature. Anyway, I hope you guys enjoy looking at these 5 tips on how to cut your deck down to 100 cards. These are things that have helped me immensely in my own deck building and things that I use all the time while I'm building decks for the channel and just for myself. So I really hope you got something out of this video. And of course, videos like this wouldn't be possible without my awesome Patreon supporters, so I have to thank you guys. You guys are awesome. Anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed this video. As always, feel free to comment, like, or subscribe. Thank you for watching.